The Medici. Chapter 7. The Frescoes in the Chapel of the Medici Palace.
Please like this video so that more people have access to this content. Enjoy and also follow this channel to see other videos about art.
The Frescoes in the Chapel of the Medici Palace. Just as the Medici Palace is inseparably connected with Cosimo, so is that which in these days chiefly attracts attention to it connected with Piero. Of all the mass of art treasures which that palace contained in the time of Cosimo, Piero, and Lorenzo, one alone now remains there. The frescoes painted for Piero il Gottoso on the walls of the little chapel on the first floor by Benozzo Gozzoli. They merit special consideration on the three grounds of their historical interest, their being this painter's masterpiece, and their combining examples of his powers in two different aspects, those on the walls of the chancel being occupied with a religious subject, and those round the body of the chapel with an historical one. Although a window now exists, all authorities state that originally this chapel had no window, and that all these beautiful frescoes were painted by lamplight. If so, it increases our admiration of the master's talent. They are still in perfect preservation, though nearly 450 years have passed since they were executed. Over the altar, where the window now is, there was originally a picture of the Nativity by Filippo Lippi. All round the chapel at the lower part of the walls runs an ornamental border consisting of Piero's device of a single diamond ring and the motto Semper. The chancel pictures. These give us an example of Benozzo Gozzoli's powers as a devotional painter, the pupil of Fra Angelico. And although this was not the line in which Gozzoli excelled, these pictures show that he can, on occasion, breathe into his work not a little of the spirit of his master. On the two side walls of the chancel, covering the whole height of the wall, Gozzoli gives us two pictures representing the world on that night of the Nativity of Christ, referred to in the picture which was over the altar. He lays his scene amidst Italian garden and woodland scenery, with groups of angels passing about everywhere, singing their song of "Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace." There are on each wall three groups, one kneeling, another standing, and a third flying. All are turned toward the altar, or rather towards the picture of the Nativity over it. The kneeling groups, those nearest to that on which the attention of all is concentrated, are, unlike the rest, not singing. They are intently gazing at the great mystery before them of the incarnation in a human body of Him whom they have ever known as the second person of the Holy Trinity, that mystery regarding which we are told that the angels desire to look into it, and, bowed in awe, are lost in silent wonder and devotion at such transcendent love on the part of God for the human race. The thoughts in their minds are shown in the glories round their heads, in which some have the words Gloria in excelsis Deo, others Adoremus, others Et in terra pax. The standing groups, a little further back, are occupied in recounting to each other the wonder of this greatest event in the world's history, and, singing loudly, are calling on all to come and see it. The flying groups are hastening up from the distance to see this wonder of God becoming man, and gazing down at it in adoration. The spirit of the entire picture may be summed up in the words, God so loved the world, while it is made all the more impressive by not containing any representation of that at which all are so intently gazing. Seeing as we do only its profound impression upon them, our attention is drawn to concentrate itself on the greatness of the deed which can thus impress even the angels. Probably in the very devotional spirit of this picture is to be seen the influence of Lucrezia Tornabuoni, who no doubt had much to say in regard to its design. Behind the principal groups, angels pick roses in the gardens, a little cherub rests placidly in the top of a tree, bright-colored birds fly or stand without fear among the angels, and all is happiness and peace. The beautiful peacock wings of the angels, the brilliant coloring of the birds, the exquisitely painted roses, and other details make the picture as deserving of admiration for its execution as it is for its general design. In accordance with the custom of the old masters, and to exemplify that in the things of the spiritual world time and place are non-existent, the background shows us Italian scenery with castles and villages of the Middle Ages. The general idea of the picture is carried out even in the landscape, its stiffness and formality being due to this cause. Intending that his picture shall breathe throughout it the thought embodied in the singing angel's words, of peace brought to a world tortured by sin and sin's results, the master gives to his landscape such characteristics as shall accord with this idea. Ruskin, in speaking of this point, says, "In these sort of pictures, by masters such as Raphael, Perugino, or Benozzo Gozzoli, whereas all mountain forms are in nature produced by convulsion or modelled by decay, and all forest grouping is wrought out with varieties of growth, all such appearances are purposely banished. The trees go straight, equally branched on each side, and of such slight and feathery frame as shows them never to have encountered blight, or frost, or tempest. The mountains stand up in fantastic pinnacles with no fallen fragments, the seas are always waveless, the skies always calm, crossed only by far, horizontal, lightly wreathed white clouds." He cites this picture as an example, and points out how roses and pomegranates, their leaves drawn to the last rib and vein, twine themselves in fair and perfect order about delicate trellises, broad stone pines and tall cypresses overshadow them, bright birds hover here and there in the serene sky, and groups of angels glide and float through the glades of an unentangled forest. In this manner has Benozzo Gozzoli in these chancel pictures written his burning message, and in a language which those of every nationality can read. The pictures in the body of the chapel. While the chancel pictures are occupied with the first episode connected with the Nativity of Christ, those in the body of the chapel are concerned with the second episode connected therewith, the journey of the three kings, or Magi, Il Viaggio dei Re Magi, to Bethlehem. And here we have an example of Benozzo Gozzoli's powers in his own special line, that of an historical painter, the religious subject being made merely a vehicle for references to the history of the Medici. In doing this, Gozzoli would of course desire to introduce as many allusions as possible complementary to the family, but the manner in which he has done this is remarkable. The picture is from end to end an elaborate memorial pointing to all that the Medici had up to that time done for Florence, and for which they had gained honor among their countrymen. But while the whole idea is wonderfully conceived and worked out, the empty flattery by which many painters of that age would have spoiled the effect is avoided. Thus we have in this picture far more than merely a gorgeous procession of the Magi, into which have been introduced portraits of several of the Medici, which is the description it has generally received. To carry out the above general idea, Gozzoli sets to work to make his picture speak of all that had taken place in Florence in connection with this family during the preceding 30 years. Of how the great gathering of 1439 had been invited to Florence at the instigation of the Medici, and hospitably entertained there by them. Of how this assemblage had included an emperor, the successor of Constantine the Great, and a patriarch of Constantinople, the equal, theoretically, of the Pope in Rome, of how it had brought to Florence the most learned men of the time, and furthered that revival of the ancient learning which the Medici had, ever since the foundation stone of this palace was laid, been fostering, of how as a consequence of the hospitality of 1439, learning and culture when driven from Constantinople had taken refuge in Florence, and, lastly, of how the judicious political guidance of the Medici had increased Florence's power and prosperity and advanced her over the heads of other states which had previously been her rivals. Of all this the picture speaks, and the admirable manner in which Gozzoli has worked out this general scheme demonstrates his great talents as an historical painter. Gozzoli selects for the first of his three kings or wise men the patriarch of Constantinople, Joseph. This is the patriarch who had come to Florence for the council of 1439 and who died there a month before it ended. He is the old man on the mule, of which half the body has been cut off in order to make a new entrance many years ago into the chapel, as though to show how little splendid frescoes like this were valued at the time this act of vandalism was committed. Although the Pope of Rome, Eugenius IV, had also been one of the important personages at the council, Gozzoli, in preference to him, chooses the Patriarch of Constantinople, both as being an Eastern potentate, and also in allusion to those many dealings which the Medici had had with Constantinople in their unearthing of the ancient classical literature. For the second king, Gozzoli chooses John Palaeologus, John VII, the Emperor of the East. This John VII is the emperor who had come to the Council of 1439, the last emperor but one, before, by the fall of Constantinople, the eastern half of the Roman Empire came to an end, as the western half had done 1,000 years earlier. As the successor of Constantine the Great, even though his empire had then shrunk to little more than its capital city, he was theoretically the greatest of all earthly sovereigns. And though by the time that this picture was painted, his empire had for 16 years ceased to exist, Gozzoli nevertheless puts him in as the second king for the same reason as before, namely, because he wishes to point to the Council of 1439, to Florence having been the city to which it was transferred, and to the part which the Medici had had in that transfer, and in giving its members such royal hospitality there. For the third king, Gozzoli takes the young heir of the family, Lorenzo de Medici. By putting him in as one of the three kings, Gozzoli makes the Medici not merely attendants upon the wise men, but wise men themselves, and, by the exalted company in which he is placed, contrives a powerful compliment to the family. Behind the three kings comes their retinue, and here we find the Medici leading a gathering of all the most learned men of the time. In the front line we have the two brothers, Cosimo Pater Patriae, in an embroidered coat, and on his charger's trappings the Medici arms, with 7 balls, and his own private crest of the 3 peacocks' feathers, and on his right his brother Lorenzo, typically mounted on a quiet and humble mule. In the left corner Piero il Gotosso, as usual with bare head, and next to him, on the white horse, the young 15-year-old Giuliano, preceded by a negro with a bow, in allusion to Giuliano's love of sport. Giuliano's horse, alone, has a jewel on the frontlet of its bridle. In each case Gozzoli, ignoring likenesses, has devoted much care to the dress and general appearance. And then, behind these members of 3 generations of the Medici family, comes a long procession of scholars and literati, extending far into the distance, and including both those Florentines whom the Medici had taught to care for and seek after learning, such as Marsilio Ficino, the brothers Pulci, and others, and also those celebrated Greek scholars from Constantinople, whom the Medici had induced to settle in Florence, and to whom they had given appointments as professors of classical learning, such as Argyropoulos, Chalcondylas, and others, or who had come to the Council of 1439, such as Bessarion, Plethon, and others, and who are distinguished from the Florentines by their Greek headdresses. The Florentines are all close-shaven, whereas the Greeks, in the Eastern fashion, wear beards. The man on foot, with a black cap, immediately behind Cosimo, is Salviati, a strong adherent of the Medici and tutor to Giuliano. Amidst the crowd of literati, Gozzoli has inserted himself, between two of the learned Greeks, and to prevent his name being lost, and also perhaps because he might scarcely be expected in such company, has carefully written his name round his cap. Throughout the whole picture it is learning, and not wealth or power, which is exalted. The Pope of Rome was infinitely more wealthy and powerful than the Patriarch of Constantinople, and many of the sovereigns of the time than the Emperor of the East, and again, those who accompany the Medici in the retinue of the three kings are, not the wealthiest Florentines, but the most learned. In the forepart of the cavalcade, in front of the Patriarch, is introduced a gorgeously apparelled youth on a handsomely caparisoned horse, on the back of which he carries a hunting leopard. This is one of those scherzi, or jokes, such as the old masters loved, while it is made at the same time to serve the general object of the picture. The person represented is Gastruccio Gastracani, Duca di Lucca, a celebrated and terrible commander, and a formidable enemy of Florence, who, in the early part of the 14th century, fought furiously against her, conquering Pisa and Pistoia, devastated Florence's territory, and carried war up to her very walls, and, to the indignation of the Florentines, was nominated by the Emperor Louis of Bavaria to be imperial governor of Tuscany. Gozzoli's scherzo consists in representing this terrible enemy as a mere youthful hunter, excelling only in field sports, and contrasted in every way with the wise and learned Florentines. He is trying to force his prancing horse through a crowd of them, but they pay little attention to him, excepting one, who holds up his hand, forbidding him to proceed. In all of which we have allusion to the fact that whereas Lucca had previously been Florence's formidable rival, and whereas in two wars before the Medici arose, Florence, guided by the Albizzi, had been worsted by Lucca, she had now been carried by the Medici to a position of power and importance far beyond that which Lucca possessed, and had entirely put a stop to Lucca's triumphal career. Thus, in this picture we have brought before our minds, in one general view, all that the Medici, up to the point in their career which they had reached in 1469, had achieved in reviving learning, in advancing the glory of Florence as the most cultured city in Italy, and in advancing her in political power. And what Gozzoli had to say as regards these achievements of the first three generations of the family was rendered in such fashion that it could be read by multitudes who could understand no word of Italian, while his record has proved a lasting one. The picture possesses much historical interest apart from its allusions to the deeds of the Medici. The portraits and dresses of the Emperor and the Patriarch, the dresses and appointments of the cavalcade, and similar details are not imaginary. 30 years before, when he was about 20, Gozzoli had himself seen the Emperor and the Patriarch in the processions and functions which took place during the summer of 1439. He had also lately seen the no less splendid array of the tournament of February 1469, and he takes his materials from both these, thus reproducing before our eyes persons, dresses, and customs of which we should otherwise have but little idea. The Patriarch of Constantinople is shown in the dress he wore in the processions of 1439. On his head he has the ancient headdress which he was almost the last to wear, and the chief point noticeable about this headdress is that, while his colleague, the Pope of Rome, had gradually altered it until it had grown into the triple crown, that of Constantinople had been kept as it was at the first. In the portrait of the Emperor John VII, John Palaeologus, we are shown him as he appeared during the processions in 1439. It is highly interesting from the fact that it is probably the sole portrait now existing in the world of anyone of all that long line of emperors, from Constantine the Great downwards, who sat on the throne of Constantinople for 1130 years. His dress and the trappings of his charger are very magnificent. On his head he wears, entwined with his turban, the peculiar crown of the Eastern emperors of Rome, so different in shape from that which had by that time been adopted by all sovereigns in Western Europe. Unlike the Florentines, he, according to the Eastern fashion, wears a beard. His face is dignified, yet has a melancholy expression, as well it may, as he sees that once glorious empire in its last throes, and knows there is no hope of any assistance coming from the West to save it. Lorenzo de Medici's dress is that which he had lately worn at the tournament of February 1469. We note the rubies and diamonds in his cap, the velvet embroidered surcoat, just showing on his arm, and the cape, like a sleeved surplice, of white silk edged with red, with his sword belt worn over it. He rides the great white charger which had been presented to him by the King of Naples for the tournament, and the trappings of this charger have all over them the 7 Medici balls. The mounted pages, heralds, men-at-arms on foot, etc., are also all in the dresses which they wore at Lorenzo's tournament. The journey of the Magi, always a favorite subject with the old masters on account of its great possibilities for picturesque treatment, has nowhere else been treated on so magnificent a scale. The splendid procession is given every accessory that can add to its picturesque splendor: beautiful youths, gorgeous dresses, fine horses, hunting leopards, greyhounds, falcons, etc., and winds its way up and down over the rocky paths and wooded slopes of the Apennines, amidst castles, villages, and cypress groves, while all is painted in colors that are almost as fresh as when laid on. The date of these frescoes is somewhat of a problem. Ruskin states that they were painted between 1457 and 1459. All other authorities say between 1459 and 1463, while both Ruskin and all other authorities say, rightly enough, that they were painted for Piero il Gottoso. The latter, however, did not become head of the family until 1464, while there are also further grounds than this for considering that none of these dates can be correct. In 1457, Lorenzo was a child of only 8 years old, and Giuliano only 4 years old, which makes Ruskin's date at any rate impossible. And even at the latest of the above dates, 1463, Lorenzo was no more than 14, and Giuliano only 10, scarcely an age at which fondness for field sports has been developed. Again, all authorities consider that the dresses and appointments of the cavalcade in the procession of the Magi reproduce the festive pomp and splendor of the pageants of the Medici. Now, the earliest of these pageants was held in February 1469, when Lorenzo was 19 and Giuliano 15, and none can look at the picture with the account of that pageant before him and have any doubt that the tournament of February 1469, formed the model for the dresses and appointments of Lorenzo, the pages, men-at-arms, grooms, and serving men in the picture, while ages of 19 and 15 accord with the representation therein of Lorenzo and Giuliano, which ages of 14 and 10 do not. So that the internal evidence of the picture bars all dates earlier than February 1469. On the other hand, 2 letters, without date, regarding the work were written to Piero il Gottoso by Gozzoli while employed on it, and the tone and expressions used show that Piero was then head of the family. This would bar all dates earlier than August 1464, or later than December 1469. While yet a further difficulty, and that which has no doubt been the chief reason for the dates hitherto assigned to these frescoes, is introduced by the fact that from 1463 to 1467 Gozzoli was painting his great series of frescoes at San Gimignano, writing dated letters from thence at that period, and that in 1468 he signed an agreement for the execution of his great work in the Pisa Campo Santo, which he is usually supposed to have begun in 1469, and which was his last work. In the midst of such conflicting evidence, part of which, that given by the picture itself, is too strong to be ignored, the only solution appears to be that these frescoes were painted neither between 1457 and 1459, nor between 1459 and 1463, but between January 1468 and December 1469. The chancel pictures, and possibly some portion of the leading part of the procession, including perhaps the figures of the Patriarch and the Emperor, being painted between January 1468 and January 1469, and the remainder of the frescoes in the body of the chapel between February 1469 and December 1469, the work at Pisa not being begun until quite the end of that year. The whole chapel was certainly painted while Piero il Gottoso was head of the family, 1464 to 1469. The chancel pictures could only have been begun upon Gozzoli's return from San Gimignano, that is, in 1468, while the details connected with the tournament and the ages of Lorenzo and Giuliano make February to December 1469 the only possible period when the chief part of the frescoes in the body of the chapel could have been executed. Benozzo Gozzoli was noted for his extreme rapidity of work, and though these frescoes are filled with a multiplicity of details, it was possible for such an artist as he was to execute them in 2 years.
We hope you enjoyed this video. Please let us know in the comments what other art contents you would like to see. And don't forget to like this video and follow our channel. Thank you, and until the next video.